Welcome back to JavaScript Fundamentals. Today you are going to learn how to dynamically add content to a web page after it's been loaded in the browser. Now bear in mind these changes are not permanent. We do nothing to save these changes to the HTML. These are just done while the page is loaded into the browser. So whenever the browser navigates to a different page and then goes back to the page, the same JavaScript has to execute in order to add that content back to the page. So these changes are not permanent. They are just done in memory in the browser for as long as that page is in the browser. So let's get started. We are going to use the HTML document that we ended with in the previous lesson. So to give you a brief recap of what we have 4 paragraph elements followed by a div element that contains another paragraph element. It has an ID of foo, and then that's it. Of course, we have our script element, but that's just kind of there. So let's say that we want to add another paragraph element to this document, but we want to add it at the very end of the document so that it's placed right before the closing body tag. Well, if we go back to our JavaScript file, we simply do that by using some DOM methods. But first we need to create a variable to store this element object that we are going to create, because we create the element and then we add it to the document. We don't create and add, or we don't add and create. That would be kind of hard. But we do create it. We need to store it in a variable so that we can access that element object to give it some attributes or some other content, and then we will add it to the document. I use the variable name of L whenever I need to refer to some generic element, or if I'm lazy and I don't want to name it something specific. This is just something that I use. You can feel free to name your variable whatever you want to name it. But if you were to look at a lot of my code, you would see L used quite often. So we need to assign this a value, obviously. So let's use a method of the document object called createElement. And as it is aptly named, it creates an element for us. And all we have to do is tell it what type of element that we want it to create by passing a string value that contains the element's tag name. So if we wanted to create a div element, we could do that. Or if we wanted to create a horizontal line, we could do that as well. But we want to create a p element, so we will just simply pass in p. The createElement method only creates the element. It does not add it to the document. So to do that, we need to use another method called appendChild, because we are going to be appending a child element to some other element within the document. Now we want to add this to the end of the body. So it's going to be placed after the script tag. So to do that, we say document.body.appendChild, and then we pass in the element object that we've created. But whenever we run this in the browser, we're not going to see any difference because we haven't given this element any content to see. But if you remember from the previous lesson, I mentioned that the getElementsByTagName method returns a live node list. So that means any change that we make to the document regarding p elements, that node list should have all of the updates that we've made. So let's do something like this. Let's go p elements equals document getElementsByTagName, and we'll pass p, and then let's alert p elements.length, and we need to get rid of that c, and then we create the p element, we add it to the document, and then let's alert the length again. So whenever this code executes, we should see the value of 5 on line 5, so let's put a comment there. And then after we create the p element and add it to the body, we should see the value of 6 on line 11. So let's run this in the browser and we'll see if I am correct. So we see the value of 5 and then we see the value of 6. So I wanted to show you that yes, the live node list is indeed live, and that the changes that we make to the document are reflected by this live node list. So that also shows you that we did indeed create an element and add it to the document, because whenever we called the length property again on our node list, then we got a value of 6. Now, one important thing I should have pointed out in the previous lesson, but I didn't, and I apologize for that. But whenever we used the query selector all, this returns a node list, but it's not a live node list. It only returns the p elements that are within the document at the time that this method was called. So if we go back to the browser and refresh, we will see the value of 5 used twice. So in order to update p elements, we would once again have to call the query selector all method. So let's go ahead and do that. P elements equals document dot query selector all p, and then whenever we run it in the browser again, then we will see that the length updated. So that is a very important difference between the query selector all and passing in a tag name as opposed to using the get elements by tag name method. Well, let's get rid of all of this extra code so that we can focus on the creation code. Okay, so now that we have an element, let's give it some content. And one of the ways we can do so is to create a text node. Now, if you remember from the previous lesson, I mentioned that everything within the DOM is a node of some type. We have element nodes, attribute nodes, and we also have text nodes. And text nodes are pure text. So whenever we create a text node and we give it whatever text that we want to be in that text node, if we use HTML, it's going to convert it to text. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to create a variable called content, and then I'm going to call the create text node method of the document object. It's very descriptive as to what it does, and then we just need to pass the text that we want this text node to have. So let's go ahead and pass some HTML so that you can see what it does. So let's do strong, and then this was dynamically created. We need to close the strong tag. And now we have created some content, but as with the element that we've created, it's just sitting out there. It's not a part of any document, so we have to append it to whatever element that we want to append it to. And in this case, we want to use our element object that we created, so we're going to use L, and then dot, and then append child, and then content. Then, of course, the element is being appended to the document. So if we run this within the browser, we will see a new line added at the end of the document. And you can see that it converted our HTML to text. Now, if you were going to view this with the view source, you're not going to see that change because the view source typically shows the source that was sent from the server to the browser. It does not reflect any changes made to the document through JavaScript. But most of the developer tools and all of the browsers keep track of what has changed within the document. And you can see down here that it added a p element. But it says that strong is supposed to be HTML, but that's not true. I kind of wish that it would actually convert that to text within the developer tools, but that might be something worth reporting as a bug. But anyway, you can see now the document has changed, and you can see how it has changed. So we have created an element, given it content. Let's add some attributes. And doing so is really easy. We use the element object, and then it has a method called setAttribute, and it accepts two arguments. The first is the name of the attribute that we want to set. The second is the value that we want to set to that attribute. So let's do align. And I know that you typically don't want to do this because this would be done through CSS, but for demonstration purposes, this is very good because it is visual. So if we refresh, we are going to see that text in the center of our window. And if you look in the development tools, you will see that we do indeed have an align attribute that is set to center. But we don't have to always use the setAttribute method because many attributes in the DOM are properties of an element object. For example, the ID. Now we could set the ID using setAttribute and then specifying ID, but why do that when you can just simply use ID as a property and then give it a value? Let's give it a value of bar. So if we go back to the browser, refresh, we no longer are centering this because we took that code out, but if you look in the developer tools, you'll see that this p element has an ID of bar. So that's two ways that you can set element attributes. Now, not every attribute is going to be a property of the element. So it varies. Most of the basic attributes are properties like ID. The CSS class, which we are going to actually talk about in the next lesson, is not actually class, but it's class name. And there's a few others. I think align is one of them, that are actual properties of the element. But other than those few, you would typically want to use the setAttribute method. Well, everything's been rather easy and straightforward for now, so let's change things up a little bit. Instead of adding our element right before the closing body tag, let's add it to the end of the div element. So it will be placed after our p element with an ID of foo. So it would make things really easy if we added an ID to our div element, but we're not going to do that. We are going to use DOM properties to navigate from our p element with an ID of foo to this div element. And we did so in the previous lesson, but it always helps to see things like this again. So first, let's create a variable called pfoo, and let's do document.get elements by ID, and then foo. Now we could use the query selector method that we saw in the previous lesson, but get element by ID is faster than using the query selector method. So if you know that you have an ID, even though that this is an older method, it executes faster. So use the get element by ID method to get an element by ID. So there's one other thing that I want to do. If you'll notice, we've used document several times within this code. And if you'll remember, whenever we talked about scope and identifier lookup, we are running this code inside of a function. So every time we use document, the JavaScript engine has to perform an identifier lookup for document. Well, it first looks for document inside of the scope of this function. It doesn't find it, so it has to go up to the global scope, the window object, where it will find the document identifier. Well, that's a little inefficient because it would be nice if it could find the document identifier within this level of scope. So we can do that by assigning a value or a variable. I'm going to call this doc and give it a value of document. So now we can use this doc variable in place of document, and we will get the same results, except our code is going to execute just a little bit faster, because now that we've used the doc identifier, it's going to find that right here where we have defined it. Now, of course, the JavaScript engine has to perform the lookup for document, but it only has to do that once. And then every time we use doc, it finds it within this level of scope. So we've just made our code a little bit more efficient. So now that we have our foo element, let's add our L element to the div element that contains the foo element. Whenever you start talking about elements, things just have a lot of elements to it. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is get the div element, and we do so by using the parent node property of our pfoo. This is going to get our div element, and then we can use the append child and then pass an L. So even though that this isn't as straightforward as appending the element straight to the body, it's still relatively simple, because all we had to do is get the p element with an ID of foo, get its parent, and then append the child. So if we run this within the browser, we will see, as far as visually, really nothing different. But if we look inside of the developer tools, we will see that our new p element was added to the div element. And if I toggle the collapse there, you can see that that is indeed what's going on. Now let's say that instead of appending our L object to the end of the div element so that it's behind this p with an ID of foo, that we actually insert it before our p element with an ID of foo. Well, we can do that by using the method insert before. And this accepts two arguments. The first is the element that we want to insert, and then the second is the reference element that we want to insert before. So if we go back to the browser, we will see these two p elements switch places. So refresh, and there we go. And if you look inside of our developer tools, you will see that they did indeed switch places. And once again, if you look at the source code, that's not going to take place because all of this is being done within the browser. This was not sent from the server. There's one more method I want to show you, and it's called replace child. And as its name implies, it replaces an element with another element. The arguments are the same as insert before. The first argument is the element that we are going to put into the document, and then the second argument is the one that's going to be replaced. So whenever we run this code within the browser, it's going to replace the paragraph element with this is paragraph 5 in a div. Is going to replace that with the one that we created through JavaScript. And you can also look down here in the developer tools that you will see that this one with an ID of foo will be gone. So let me refresh. And there you go. We only have one p element inside of the div element, and it's the one that we created through JavaScript. Now, before we move on, I want to point out the very specific order in which I did all this in. I created the element, gave it content, set its attributes, and then I added it to the document. And the reason being is because the DOM is slow. Anytime you start dealing with the DOM or the document that's loaded into the browser, you are going to be writing slow code. That's just how it is. And on high-powered machines, it's really not that big of a deal. But on smaller machines, ones that have limited computing power, that can add up over time. So you want to limit your impact on the DOM as much as possible. So instead of creating the element and then appending it to the document and then giving it content and attributes, all of those things are modifying the element after it's been added to the document, which causes the browser to have to readjust for that element. We do those things before we add it to the document. So always be mindful of the order in which you do things, especially whenever you're dealing with the DOM, because you could be writing some very inefficient code. Well, there's one other way that we can dynamically change or add content to a web page, and that's by using the inner HTML property. Now, we used this in the previous lesson, but I just kind of glossed over it because we were going to cover it today. Now, you don't have to create an element object to use the inner HTML property. All you have to have is an element object. So we have one by creating the L object, and we also have one with the pfoo object. But I'm going to reuse this L object that we have, and I'm going to set its content using the inner HTML property. And it does kind of the same thing as TextNode, except it doesn't convert HTML to text. It uses that HTML as actual HTML. So if we do strong, this is dynamically created, we will actually see bolded text within the browser. And if we leave everything else the same, let's go back and refresh, and we will see bolded text. This is dynamically created. And not only can we set that value, but we can also get that value. So if we wanted to, we could alert l.innerHTML, and then we will see this inside of an alert window. So we can use the inner HTML property to actually modify the existing HTML that is contained by an element. So for example, we could do el.innerHTML equals el.innerHTML plus, because we are concatenating a string with another string, let's do a breaking line. This was 2. So whenever we run this in the browser, we will see that we have modified the HTML of that p element. And we can actually do this multiple times. Go back, refresh, and there we go. But there is one thing. We are using inner HTML quite a bit. And as I said just a few moments ago, we want to limit the amount of accessing the DOM as much as possible, because whenever we do get into the DOM, we are writing inefficient code. So instead of using inner HTML all these times, we can use it once to get its initial value and store it as a variable, because that's nothing more than a string. We can work with that string outside of the DOM and then set that string as the new inner HTML whenever we're ready. So let's do that. Let's create a variable called HTML. Let's give it a value of l.innerHTML. And then I am just going to paste in what I have already done. Instead of pasting in HTML multiple times, I just paste in the whole code, and then we need to set inner HTML again with the new value. So this is much faster code because we are no longer dealing with the DOM with these 3 lines of code. We are using with pure script or pure string objects. So then we just set that new string as the inner HTML, and we will get the same results as we got before, except this is executing just a little bit faster. Now, as I said, we don't have to create an element object to use inner HTML. We can use an existing element. So let's get rid of all the code that deals with the L variable, and we can just use pfoo. So let's do pfoo. We are no longer going to be using this dynamically created element. We are going to be using the one that is hard-coded into our document. So the p with an ID of foo. So if we run this, we will see that we get this is a paragraph 5 in a div, and then we have the modified HTML as well. And if you want to completely remove the content of an element using inner HTML, all you would have to do is set it to an empty string. And if we go back to the browser, refresh, we see that that is no longer there. Now, of course, the HTML is still there for the P element, but its contents are gone because we set the inner HTML as essentially nothing. So that's going to wrap up today's lesson. We learned how we can create, add, and even remove content that's already been loaded into the browser. In the next lesson, we will talk about manipulating elements by changing their style, and we can do so in various ways. So I hope you're looking forward to that. I will see you next time.